So, thank you everybody for attending this session. Now, my public service disclaimer is that I'm not a meats person or a geneticist. I'm just a dumb range cow nutritionist. So I'm going to do my very best to go through some of this carcass data because it's very relevant to what we do here. And as Dr. Perkins said, we do like small cows. Our cows are mature body weight at a Knish score 5 of 1,125 pounds, or 28 pounds, excuse me. And so this gives you an idea of some of our rangeland. I think my grad student just tagged that calf and was waiting for that mom to come say hi to her. So we train our grad students to be quick and light on their feet during some of these projects. But I do quite a bit of work in fetal programming. So what I'm going to talk about today is, you guys have probably all heard about 1,000 fetal programming presentations, so I'm not going to go through all of that business, but just kind of get you where my thought process was for this particular topic. And so we know that we can influence how that calf is developing by maternal nutrition, right? And so that overnutrition, so most of the data that you've probably read through or at least listened to speakers talk about is the undernutrition side, but that's really, very rare do we really let our cows starve a whole lot, even though during my resiliency talk yesterday, we try to push our cows a little bit. But as you look through some of that fetal programming data, when they start to see really marked changes in the fetal development, they're talking about 50% restriction as compared to what 100% of NRC requirements. And so you got to really push it hard. And so a lot of the data that I have here today, you may not see some marked difference because they're looking at 70%, 80% restriction. But I think that's more relevant to what we actually see in our industry. And so the nice thing is a lot of this stuff can be heritable. And so how we don't change the genes, but how they're expressed, right? And so Dr. Dew, when I was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming, he had just started his career there looking at muscle biology and worked with Dr. Steve Ford in the fetal programming or Center for Fetal Programming. I was kind of a wise-ass grad student, so I started the Center for Fecal Programming at the University of Wyoming, but Dr. Ford didn't think that was funny at all, and apparently neither do you guys. And so the point being is that it all intertwines, right? And so in this graphic here, we have conception, so we have the embryonic stage and going through the fetal stage. And so I think this is relevant for my presentation today, that when nutrient restriction or overnutrition occurs during pregnancy can have specific results. And that can come from the second trimester into the third trimester. But this gives us kind of a nice overview of how primary myogenesis, secondary myogenesis, so our muscle fiber development, and then we have the growth of the muscle fibers, and then we've got our adipocytes starting to show up in that muscle. And what we do to that cow can have an impact on that. And so hopefully by the end of the day, we start to come up with some ideas of maybe we can manipulate this to a certain extent to help improve some of our carcass traits. And so overall, what we know that happens during the fetal development period, right? And so fetal stage is going to be an effective time to alter marbling. And so Dr. Dew has some really nice data that suggests that, you can influence whether it be increased or decreased the amount of adiposity that those offspring are going to have. But just remember, this slide is based solely on what's happening at the fetal stage. And so it's not in the neonate or on after into finishing just yet. And so we can feel pretty confident that we can influence things. And so lambs subjected to nutrient restriction during mid-gestation had greater adipose tissue. Okay, so that's fair. Maternal nutrition can reduce muscle fiber numbers, and so that makes sense because we see lighter birth weights in some of those calves. But I'm going to show you some hot carcass weight data today that they all kind of catch up, right? And so we start to see these little minute changes that are going to have some influence. And then we start to see some changes in the type of myofibers, and so greater numbers of type 2 versus type 1 myofibers. And essentially all that means is that, that we see a lot of insulin resistance in some of these nutrient restricted models, and a lot of it comes from that change to more of a type 2, or see more type 2 fibers. And so those become kind of the signal for insulin resistance or those animals that don't respond to glucose supplementation as well, right? And so I think some questions that I posed to myself as I was putting this together, because I was really getting overwhelmed with the amount of data that was out and available within the literature, and trying to distill this down into a 30-35 minute talk was starting to cause me to lose hair, which I didn't have a whole lot to start with. And so I think what we really, can we look at some of these changes, and does it translate to endpoint carcass characteristics that are desirable, right? Or perhaps they're undesirable. And so can we use some sort of nutritional management practice that can change these, but do it in a very controlled way? Now, sometimes, like this year, we're just praying for the next, we're hoping that tomorrow it will rain. We're always getting closer to one more rain, but our cows are suffering from nutritional stress right now. And we're feeding as much as we can and as much as we can afford, because that corn price is really influencing how much we can offer those animals. And so, is there a specific feed? You know, as a nutritionist, I'm always looking for that nutritional silver bullet that is going to make them build a bronze statue of me, because I've caused and cured all the ills of the beef industry. So far, that hasn't happened. But is there something that we should feed, or maybe perhaps avoid feeding that cow during pregnancy, that can have negative effects on carcass traits? And so let's start with prepartum undernutrition. We'll go with something that we're all fairly familiar with, at least within the literature. And so how I have these set up is, it's basically because I'm getting old and forgetful, but on the first slide of a particular data set, I have the treatments down here in the bottom left-hand corner. So if you forget what I said when I introduced the slide, you better pay attention on the first one, because I can't go back apparently on this, all right? And so this work here, they just, pretty simple. They had cows in a positive plane of nutrition, and so they were grazing appropriate pasture, so it was about 11% crude protein, so met the needs of the cows during mid-gestation. And then they had a dry lot where they subjected them to an 80% restriction, so based off of NRC requirements. Right? So if we look at hot carcass weight, no statistical difference there, and no, I've got everything in metric.
I appreciate you.
But
consistent.
So get out your calculator if you need to convert it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I don't know. Anyway, I figure I can make fun of Noah too, right? Everybody else has so far.
You can.
And so at least we met before I started making fun of you, which doesn't stop me ever. All right. So that positive plane of nutrition, not a lot of difference. Essentially 5 kilos difference between the two treatments. Okay, so again, if you look at some of the data of those calves when they were born, they had some differences, but I'm trying to focus on the carcass traits. And so looking at some of that 12th rib back fat, all right, we see a tendency, if you'll allow me to use a 0.08 p-value as a tendency, to where those negative plane of nutrition cattle, or calves born to cows that were on that negative plane of nutrition during mid-gestation, we saw a reduction in 12th rib back fat. I did do one conversion for us. Right? And so longissimus muscle area, no difference there. And so we saw 12.9 versus 13.0. Okay, so, all right, that negative plane of nutrition doesn't seem so bad right now, right? And so the cows, and that's what's really interesting if you go, and it's hard to find in some of this literature, but you know, I'm really looking at stark differences in cow body condition score, but 80%, those cows just kind of laugh at it. That rumen becomes more resilient and efficient. And we didn't see in a lot of these papers where they had a nutrient-restricted treatment, there wasn't a lot of difference in body condition score, maybe half or a quarter of a body condition score difference in final body weight, okay? And so not a lot of difference in that loin muscle area either, right? And then when we actually look at the intramuscular fat, we do see, you know, at 0.17, so no statistical difference, but there is a slight increase. And so that's going to be kind of the theme as we continue on, that you'll see in some of those nutrient-restricted models is that you actually see a little more intramuscular fat, and a lot of that comes from when that fetus is subjected to nutrient restriction, it starts to have kind of a rescue mechanism where it starts storing a lot of body fat, knowing that, hey, life's probably going to be tough when I come out of this wonderful oven known as the uterus. And you probably never heard that referred to before. All right, and then if we look at the marbling to the 12th rib fat ratio, we actually see on the negative side, they had a positive ratio, so marbling being greater than the 12th rib fat, so the back fat, and so that makes sense based off of that marbling data. And so here we're seeing just a slight improvement in their ability to marble with that negative energy balance. But again, not very extreme, and so we may not see this in a normal cow herd unless we have a well-fed control, but it's not hurting the endpoint. And I think that's probably when we get to the end of this presentation, you'll see that, okay, if you do the best that you can by maintaining those cows and so they don't slip a whole lot, you're not really shooting yourself in the foot as far as carcass quality, because I think the previous speaker made it clear that perhaps we need to hold on to those cows or those calves as we're sending them through the feed yard. All right. So the study by Ramirez, I didn't have to put a note here because I could remember this one. And so essentially they restricted these guys or gals to 50% of NRC requirements versus 75%. So this is going to be a more extreme restriction versus that more moderate 75%. And then these animals were fed at maintenance. Okay, and so this is going to be a nice linear response with how we analyze this data. And so we look at steer progeny, average daily gain within the feed yard. Right, we don't see a lot of difference, but you know, a linear at P of 0.26, but 1.5 versus 1.3, if you had a large number of those animals on feed right now, you'd be pretty happy with that, okay? And so that in itself kind of starts to indicate, well, there's some efficiency differences, and Rick Funston and his group up in Nebraska, you know, they've shown some improvement in animal efficiency, both on the male and the female side, when we've restricted that. Nothing to this level, but it is interesting to see how those animals have adapted to become a little more efficient. Right? And so if we go right to that, start off with our carcass weight, that improvement in performance did show, you know, an improvement with that restrict 50, and so 284. And so the maintenance in the restricted group, their hot carcass weights weren't statistically different, but at a p-value of 0.05, or it's quadratic at 0.01, but then they did some mean square separation or mean separation for us, and so we can see that restrict 75 was actually lower, right? And so it's curious in the sense that if this, you have that quadratic response, which makes sense, but what's going on? You'd think that they're getting a few more groceries, or right, a little less restricted. The calories and everything should be just as well for those guys as the others, but for one reason or another, that particular group did not perform as well as far as carcass weight. Now, if we look at the 12th rib back fat, again, we see another quadratic response with that restricted being higher, so a little different than that Morehauser paper that we talked about at the beginning, then with the maintenance group kind of falling in line, so it's kind of intermediate to those two. But again, we have some back fat thickness, which take that for what you wish. But looking at the marbling score, right, not a lot of difference there. And so what I think you're going to see is like, well, this is really boring, Dr. Scholljegerdes. You're talking about a bunch of non-differences. But there are times, graduate students, that no differences is just as important, and that's what I'm going to try to point out today, right? And so that animal that's on that maintenance now, nobody's really going to do a 50% restriction, but the point being is that you have a linear response there, or lack thereof a linear response, that shows that it doesn't really influence that to a great degree, right? So as we're trying to push up into that choice with our calves, what we did several months ago with the cow doesn't seem to have a negative impact, right? Looking at some more, it's a little more detailed stuff for the muscle nerds in the audience. No differences in fiber diameter, collagen concentration. They did see a decreased tenderness for that restricted group at the 75% level. And so again, very interesting in that group altogether did not really perform very well. And at this time, the biology behind why a 75% restriction would be worse than a 50% restriction is really not known. And so more work needs to be done in that regard. All right, some work by Keith Underwood at South Dakota State, and he was also at Wyoming when I was there as a graduate student, looking at cattle that were either grazing a native pasture versus an improved pasture, right? So there's going to be a quality difference there where that improved is going to be considered a higher plane of nutrition than what the native. Again, the cows really didn't lose a whole lot of weight, and this was conducted during mid to late gestation, so something that we would all experience in a typical spring calving situation. Just to point out down here that these cows were going to be allotted a treatment for approximately 60 days, starting at day 120 to 150, so there was a range in the pregnancy dates for these cows, so 120 to 150 of gestation, hence the mid to late. And then by the end of that feeding period, so 60-day feeding period on either the native or improved, they were brought together and managed as one herd, and there was 10 kilograms difference between those two groups. And so 60 days, that native pasture didn't meet a whole lot of their requirements, but nevertheless, we do have some cow body weight differences here, right? And so, but with that said, overall, that calf's adjusted 205-day weaning weight did not differ. If we look at the progeny's average daily gain in the feedlot, we start to see some improvement, and this is where it would support some of the Nebraska work where that protein supplementation during late gestation saw an improvement in some of the calf performance data from Dr. Summers, Dr. Stalker, those guys. And so, okay, that's pretty interesting. And so you're going to expect to see an improvement in hot carcass weight, okay, on that improved pasture versus the native. And then if we look at the marbling score, again, 420 versus 455, and a p-value of 0.12, but nevertheless you start to see a trajectory there to where that improvement in nutritional value of the diet during that mid to late gestation did show an improvement. And again, these animals are all managed exactly the same after those treatments are ended, right? So it's pretty incredible that quite a bit of time goes between these fetal programming studies to the time that the animals are actually harvested. Some of our work, it's 700 days from the time I end my supplements to the time I actually get some carcass data on some of our fetal programming work, right? And so interestingly, Dr. Underwood went through and looked at some of the tenderness characteristics, right? And so a higher number is bad, right? Newtons, I have no idea how to convert this, so Noah.
I'm not good at that.
Okay. All right, and so basically Warner-Bratzer shear force data, and so there you see a slight increase in that native pasture versus the improved, and so there's some eating quality differences there as well, with the lower number being more desirable by our end customer. And so again, some pretty detailed work as far as looking at the tissue level. They didn't see any differences in collagen, calprotectin, troponin, myosin isoform. So it's somewhat interesting that the shear force data, and granted there wasn't a big difference between the two, but they didn't see any of these, obviously contribute to tenderness. And so as they go down, tenderness goes up. And so no differences there. They did see a tendency for increased number of fat cells for that improved pasture, which that makes perfect sense as we think about it from the marbling perspective. All right. So a pretty recent paper here by Long or not so recent, 2012, and where they looked at a control, so a non-supplemented cow group, all right, and so early to mid-gestation. So now we're looking at a little earlier time frame, right? So if you think back to Dr. Dew's graphic there, we see some myogenesis early on in gestation, and you get into the mid stage, and so a lot of muscle development is going on at that time. And so here they've got the control group that was on just a moderate forage type diet, and then they had nutrient restricted plus protein, and restricted to 70% of requirements, and then we have nutrient restricted at 70% of requirements and no protein. So here I'm kind of combining both protein supplement and nutrient restriction to see what kind of an influence that has, and perhaps maybe that protein can help rescue or further improve some of the things that we've seen thus far. And so looking at progeny hot carcass weight, no difference at p-value greater than 0.05 as described by the authors, right? And then if we look at progeny yield grade, so in that NRP 70, and so dropped off the 70 there, but that's still the same treatment. So we have the control protein at 70% or 70% restriction. And so the control and the restricted with the protein had a similar yield grade, whereas that truly nutrient restricted animal had a slightly higher yield grade at 3.4, right? And so again, starts to contribute to some of that adiposity that we see with that nutrient restricted, whereas that protein addition to that diet seemed to circumvent some of that change, right? And so I'll summarize all this stuff, kind of tie it all together as we get in. And so for being mindful of time, looking at prepartum overnutrition, we'll get into some of that, right? And so here we've got prepartum supplement and influence on progeny carcass weight, and so how they have this set up. And so this is going to be no supplement, so a forage-based diet, and then they had 2.16 kilos of dried distillers grains plus a soybean hull-based supplement, and so they're looking at levels of energy. So we're trying to get what is the impact of overfeeding these cows, and does that have a detrimental effect, aside from all the metabolic disorders that can cause, right? And then they had this high group that, holy buckets, they were getting 8 kilos of that supplement per day. So they were probably pretty happy and fat, right? And so, but again, if we think about the nutritional difference between these groups, we really don't see any difference as far as heart carcass weight. If we look at the loin-eye area, definitely no difference at a p-value of 0.92. Okay, and so aside from those cows really being fed almost to the point where you think they were overfed, hence the title of this particular section, those calves were able to be resilient in the sense that the non-supplemented were able to catch up, and as far as overall muscle growth, doesn't seem to be a huge impact on fiber development during that fetal stage, but also in the ability to lay down muscle during the feedlot period. Now, if we look at the percent average choice, we do see a p-value of 0.04 in this data set, with that high supplemented group being at 35% versus 28% for that low versus 17 for the non-supplemented group. And so here we actually see some value to that high protein as far as providing a higher percentage of that particular contemporary group to degrade in that average choice area. And so here they actually have excessive in their title, so they were honest at least. And so in this Wilson paper, they've got excessive prepartum protein supplementation, and so the requirement was going to be 100% of NRC crude protein requirements versus 129% of crude protein requirements. So not as bad as the previous one, but it is above 100%, so we can call that excessive. All right, so hot carcass weight, no differences there. We see a trend in that hard carcass weight, all right? And so with the yield grade, we did have a significant increase in the yield grade for that high protein diet. Overall marbling score, no differences there, 453 versus 481 on a numeric basis, but as far as really changing anything statistically, we didn't see, or they did not see any difference. All right, so that was kind of quick because there's not a whole lot of data out there on the overnutrition side of things, right? A lot of it at this point, there's some really cool data where they're looking at it from the fetal perspective, but they usually end it, as they dissect the animal, mid-gestation, late gestation. And so a lot of work still needs to be done on that overnutrition side of the, that kind of work. Now, University of Illinois, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Scheich and others there, they've done a lot of overnutrition stuff, but it's been really hard to see. There's not a lot of differences there in their particular model. So looking at some of our different types of supplements here. All right, brace yourself for this, right? And so pretty new paper. So this one's actually 2022. So they have, this is out of Florida. They have a winter molasses plus urea. And so when you see W, that means they just fed this during the winter months. The Y stands for they fed it and kept it out year long. Right? So they really hated their graduate students to make them supplement for an entire year, right? But you sit through any kind of nutritional programming with some industry folks, and that's kind of a big push for a lot of folks around here as well, is that they're starting to keep tubs out year round just so those cows have something to help them through 365 days a year. And so I'm too cheap to do that kind of stuff, but what are the ramifications of that? So I think it's a pretty interesting project here. And so then they had a year-long cube, and so a wheat mid-based cube year-long. And so here we've got a more of a structural carbohydrate source. There's a little bit of starch in wheat mids, but for the most part, it's a nice structural carbohydrate that's good energy, a little bit of protein. And then we've got the molasses urea, and so that's going to be more of the readily fermentable, soluble carbohydrates, right? And so then we've got this more of a typical supplementation type program. All right, starting off with our hard carcass weights. At least I was consistent, right? And so we've got no differences there across those three treatments. And here we've got that 12th rib back fat thickness, right? So that winter molasses, and again, the reason I threw out that it was Florida, so they, the winter months there, this actually started, they started supplementing these things, the winter months at about 120 days of gestation, or 150 days of gestation. And, they started at day 0 for 365 days, and then they got into the winter months about 120 days. That put the cows on that winter supplementation treatment at 260 days of gestation, right? So they really didn't get a lot of supplement prior to, but it's how things work down there with the unique growing seasons and whatnot. Just wanted to throw that out there as far as, there's not a whole lot of supplement in that winter treatment that's going to influence the fetus, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But really so we can start focusing on that as we move forward. All right, and so if we look at the percent progeny that graded low choice, right? So, wow, P less than 0.01, that I just complained about that supplement, and they didn't feed it for very long during pregnancy, but certainly have some influence there, obviously as that calf was born, and so a little less of the fetal programming per se, but on this particular treatment, and so that's going to be helping milk production and things like that, obviously. But again, these guys should also receive the same thing since it's year-round, right? And so for that molasses group, year-round, 31% versus 58% for that cube, right? So now we're starting to see, okay, well maybe there's an energy source effect going on here, right? And I guess I can't go back, but that kind of became their conclusion, is that molasses, that source of that more soluble, highly readily available starch type energy coming from that molasses, because it's sugarcane molasses, so a lot of sucrose coming in there as well, that has the potential to be deleterious as far as marbling, but obviously more work needs to be done. Now, looking at this work here, we've got a dry lock grass hay, right? And here we've got a corn-based ration, and so 60% of the diet was coming straight from whole shell corn, and then we had 66.5% of the diet. So these were in a dry lot situation, and so pretty high level of dry distillers grains in that, so that's going to have a soluble carbohydrate or a structural carbohydrate, some fats, and quite a bit of protein in that particular ration, right? And so again, this is going to be done during that late gestation prepartum period, right? And so here we've got hard carcass weight, no difference across any of the three treatments. And so this is kind of going to get to the heart of that starch versus more structural carbohydrates. 12th rib back fat, they saw no differences there either. And then once you start looking at progeny marbling score, right? You start to see, so looking at the superscripts there, the hay group versus the distillers group, no difference, and then the distillers ended up being intermediate. But again, something with that higher starch or more readily fermentable sugar seemed to have a depressing effect on that marbling score, right? And if you look at their quality grades, so this is the percent select, and they had percent choice and all that, but there wasn't really any difference. But this really stood out to me as I was looking through this data, that essentially none of the hay group graded select, and so up to 16% of that corn-based supplement group and only 6.4 of that distiller's grain supplement. And so that, again, there's some sort of metabolic interaction taking place there when you have that cow subjected to a high level of that readily fermentable carbohydrate. So you've got increased glucose concentrations, you've got increased insulin concentrations. And so it's just like with any kind of obesity model, we start to see that that whole body starts to become somewhat insulin insensitive, and that also can have an influence on the different fiber types or whatnot that can then translate into that animal depositing fat or not depositing fat in different regions of the body. Some work from one of our colleagues here at New Mexico State when he was a young graduate student, Dr. Adam Summers, working out of Rick Funston's laboratory. So here he's actually looking at different types of protein. So now we're going to talk about bypass protein, one of our favorite subjects here at New Mexico State. A lot of work that we do involves this, and so here they had a control, just a meadow hay with no supplement, and then they had the high protein supplement that's going to contain a higher level of RUP, so that's coming, the source of that is going to be the dry distiller's grains, where we have a lower amount coming from corn gluten feed, so you're looking at 36 versus 56% bypass protein in these two supplements. All right, so is there a difference, even though it's still protein, the composition of that protein where it's escaping the rumen and having a greater influence on gluconeogenic precursors and whatnot, does that have an influence? So hot carcass weight, I could have just said, I could have left that out and just said, that never changes, right? But at least you know, sometimes I lie. All right, so then we've got 12th rib back fat thickness, right? We start to see a reduction, so with that control. So this is going to be a group of animals that aren't grossly underfed, but that meadow hay was kind of in that 8 to 11%. So for the most part, during late gestation, that's kind of hitting that mark, and then once they get into a lactation, obviously they need a little bit more than that, but for the most part, that was the range of the quality of that meadow hay. Looking at that higher bypass protein, not a whole lot of difference between the control and then that low being reduced further at the 1.85 centimeters. Right? And then, okay, how does that start to translate, or can we start to see some differences in marbling score? And again, that control group had a higher marbling score at 680 versus 659 at 648. So this was a statistical difference. If you start to look at the standard error bars, the difference comes between the control and the low, with it being the lowest, with that high being intermediate. And so at this point, we're really not seeing that high bypass protein making a significant impact on the marbling score. But what's really curious as to how well that control group is being just slightly meeting their protein requirements. And then if you look at the percent average choice, again, p-value of 0.042, they didn't offer any standard errors, which is hard to do with percentages, but nevertheless, you see 80% of those calves graded average choice on that control versus the high. And so, again, as we start to get into this and really start to pull it all together, you know, you're thinking that, man, this fetal programming stuff has got me so afraid that I can't let my cows drop at all because I'm going to mess something up. And now there's a lot we don't quite fully understand, and there's a lot of reproductive and growth performance type stuff that we're starting to see when it's extreme. But again, that nutrient restriction being as minimal as 70 to 80%, we didn't see a lot of challenges or changes there in how the animal performed, but we did see some improvement in intramuscular fat, right? High levels of starch or some readily available, like the sucrose coming from that sugarcane molasses, but something that's going to be highly fermented rather quickly and provide a lot of excess energy and propionate to that animal. Did show in a couple of those studies that we do see a reduction in carcass quality. And if you look back at some of the obesity stuff where they look at the fetal, you start to see already some changes in how the pancreas functions, and obviously those tissues as they're developing as well. And so excess starch type supplements can be problematic for those calves as we move forward. And again, there's a lot of opportunity for work carrying these animals out to final endpoint of being either slaughtered or at least carrying the heifers out and looking at longevity of those. And then despite the evidence of that reduced birth weight, I thought this was pretty interesting, going back to my high carcass weight, that those calves seem to be pretty resilient when we're looking at just sale of carcass, right? And so we've already heard today that that's not a bad, that's kind of where we're headed, right? And so I think as a producer, ranchers in the room, that just keep maintaining those cows and making sure you're doing what you're doing currently, and they're probably not, you're not going to be hurting your carcass quality, and more work needs to be done to try to find that silver bullet so they can make that bronze statue of me. So